The first one is Kevin O'Regan, that you can see is the white-haired person in one of the screens. Actually, he did many things. He was the former director of the Laboratoire de Psychologie de la Perception at the National Research Council in Paris, at the University Paris Descartes. Actually, he achieved several insights about the topics that we are discussing, because actually in his PhD he was able to show the existence of an optimal position when the eye fixate words. Then actually I think one of the great contribution was, from my standpoint, was that by questioning some established idea, and we will go in detail on this, more in detail on this later. Actually, he was able to predict the phenomenon of change blindness. No, so I'm sure he will show some experiments of the fact that sometimes we really don't notice big changes in scenes that we are looking at. Actually, now is actually working on a sensorimotor approach to vision and sensation in general. And it is worth notice that he published recently, so he did many things, so I'm sorry if I shorten a bit, but actually he recently wrote a very interesting book which was published by Oxford University Press, which is has an intriguing title, which is "Why Red Doesn't Sound Like a Ball." No, which is you will understand what he means in about 40 minutes.
Okay, so I'll start. This is the first time I've given a video conference of this kind, so I hope it will go okay and that you'll be able to understand. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be talking to people all around the world at this time. So my name is Kevin O'Regan. I work in Paris at the Laboratoire Psychologie de la Perception. I'm a psychologist, but my work has been moving more and more towards the problem of consciousness, and I'm interested in applying this to robotics. And today I'm going to talk about how we could make a robot that really feels something. Now consider this excerpt from the British newspaper, the Daily Mail, where appeared the following story. It's talking about the robot Now, made by Aldebaran Robotics here in Paris, and it says it's the first robot able to feel emotions and form bonds with humans that look after it. And you see in the picture, University of Hertfordshire researcher Dr. Lola Canamero with Now, a robot that can show its emotions and form a bond with humans. Now, do you really believe this? Do you really believe that robots can have emotional bonds with humans? And look what the actual reporter says. He says, Now has been designed to mimic the emotional skills of a 1-year-old child. So, like the author here, most people think that the robot does not really feel emotions. Most people think that the robot just mimics the emotions. However, I think most people are wrong. I actually think there's nothing to stop robots from having real feels. So to understand why, let me start by understanding why people think that there might be a problem. So let's just take the example of a pain. How could we build a robot that actually feels a real pain? So for inspiration to answer this question, let's look at how pains actually occur in humans. Now, we all know that in humans, if you put your finger on a burning stove, there's information that is transmitted up into the spinal cord, where you have interactions that cause your muscles to twitch and your finger jerks out of the fire. Now, this is just an action-reaction loop, and it could easily be built into a robot. But surely that is not enough to make the robot have a pain. You know, you need something more. And that's presumably why the information loop in the spinal cord is connected to higher order areas in the brain. You see here there's connections going up into the brain. So let's see what happens in the brain. This is just an action-reaction loop, could easily be put into a robot, and we need something more, which is presumably higher up in the brain. Now, there are many regions involved in the brain that are involved in pain, and their organization is rather complicated. There are also chemical pathways involving neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, neuropinephrine. But whatever the complex circuitry, it's after all just circuitry. And it's not clear how just circuitry, just connections, could ever generate a pain. Even in the brain, after all, you just have interactions and reactions. How could such interactions and reactions actually generate a pain? There seems to be a problem here. Let's look at another question. The redness of red. What generates the feel of a color? What exactly is different about the activation for red and the activation for green that give you the quality of redness and the quality of greenness? Let's look in the brains to see how this might be done. We know that the brain registers colors because the retina has three types of so-called cones, which are photoreceptors sensitive to three different kinds of wavelengths, the long wavelengths, medium wavelengths, and short wavelengths. You see here in the graph the spectral sensitivity for different wavelengths, the sensitivity of the long, medium, and short wavelengths cones. And these cones are distributed in the central part of the retina, the fovea. You see here the red, green, and blue dots are examples of L, M, and S cones that are spread out inside the retina. And the information from these cones is then recombined into three channels that are called the luminance channel, where L, M, and S cone excitation is combined by adding them together. And then there's two color channels, a red-green channel and a blue-yellow channel, where the L, M, and S cone information are combined by adding and subtracting in a different way. And so what you might say is that you get the red feeling, for example, when the red-green channel is maximally activated in the red direction. And you would get the blue-yellow feeling when the blue-yellow channel is activated in the... You get the blue feeling, for example, when the blue-yellow channel is activated maximally in the blue direction. Okay? But it turns out that this is not what actually happens. Because in order to get a feeling of pure red, it turns out that you actually have to have the blue-yellow channel a little bit activated in the yellow direction. And the same is true in order to feel the feeling of perfect blue. You have to have a little bit of the green-red channel activated in the green direction. So something is wrong with the idea that it's just activity in these channels that gives you the pure feelings of red and green and blue and yellow. So let's look up higher in the brain what might be going on in order to explain why and when you get the feelings of pure red and green and blue and yellow. So this is a map of the brain areas that are connected with the retina. The retina is way down at the bottom, and you see that the cortical areas connected to the retina are extremely complex. And here area V4, which you see marked in red, is the area that's sometimes considered to be responsible for color sensation. And now you could say, well, what happens in this color area in order to make you get the red sensation when the red when you have red sensitive cones that are excited, and what makes the activity in that area V4 have the property that it gives you red rather than green? And you can see that there's a problem here again, because after all, what goes on in area V4 can only be kind of actions and reactions and electrical connectivity and perhaps some chemical activity, but how could electrical interactions and chemical activity ever give you the feeling of red rather than the feeling of green? And supposing you found that the feeling of red was generated when you had a particular recurrent frequency of oscillation in that area V4, and the sensation of yellow occurred when you had a different frequency. Well, then I could ask you, well, what is it about the yellow frequency which gives you the yellow feel rather than the blue feel? There seems to be a problem in explaining what in the brain generates these different fields. We had the problem with pain. Now I'm showing you the same problem with color. And there's an even more critical question, which is the question of what I call sensory presence. So if you consider things like colors and pains, they feel like something to us. They have what I would call sensory presence. And this could be contrasted to all sorts of other brain activities which have no feel. They feel like nothing. So, for example, think about a thought. If I'm thinking about the redness of red, it doesn't feel like anything to me. The thought of red is nothing like the actual feel of red. And thinking about a pain is actually not painful. So what is it about those brain areas that carry the red information or the pain information that makes them feel like something rather than feeling like nothing? And then consider other brain activity. Consider the brain activity that's involved in registering autonomic functions, like, for example, the amount of glucose in my blood, or the amount of oxygen in my blood, or the chemical reactions in my pancreas. These are complex sensory systems in my body, which are being controlled by complex sensory systems in my brain, and yet I don't feel them at all like I feel red or a pain. So what is it different about these autonomic systems which makes them have nothing it's like in contrast to the sensory systems that register color or that register pains or auditory stimulations or tactile stimulations? There seems to be what the philosophers call an explanatory gap here. I've given the example of color, I've given the example of pain and of sensory presence. It seems that there's no common language between these fields and the mechanisms in the brain that might be generating them. There's no way, it seems, from normal scientific approach that we can understand how sensations and feels are generated by the brain. So this is why the philosophers say there's an explanatory gap. It seems that normal science will never be able to answer these questions. So what could be happening here? What could the problem be? I think the problem is a problem of definition. I think that what I've been saying up to now about feels is talking about feels in a way which is somehow inaccurate. Consider the analogy with what happened at the beginning of the 20th century when people were talking about the problem of life. People thought that it was mysterious trying to understand why it is that certain biological systems are alive and other biological systems are not alive, or other natural systems are not alive. And at the beginning of the 20th century, people thought there was a thing that they called the vital spirit, which gave rise to life. And this vital spirit, we know today, was an error. It was the wrong way of thinking about life, because we know today that life is not the kind of thing that's generated by biological systems. We know that life is a word that describes the way organic systems interact with the environment. So what I suggest is that the same mistake that was made with regard to life is being made today with regard to consciousness. I think and feel is something which is not generated by the brain. Feel is, like life, a way that we have of interacting with the environment. So I'm suggesting that we take a different view about what feel is. The standard view suggests that the brain creates or generates feels, and what I am calling the sensorimotor view suggests that, on the contrary, feel is a way of interacting with the world. So this doesn't make very much sense at first. So to understand the idea, consider the question of the softness of a sponge. I take a sponge in my hand, and it feels soft to me. Where does the softness get generated? If you looked in the brain for a softness-generating neural networks, surely that would be looking for the wrong thing, because we know that softness is not the kind of thing that's generated. Softness is a word that describes what happens when I press on soft things. Softness is not a thing that's generated. Softness is a way of interacting with soft things. It's a law that describes what happens when I press. When I press on the sponge, it squishes under my pressure. So that's what I call sensorimotor law, describes the quality of softness. So my idea is that this sensorimotor approach, thinking that fields are ways of interacting with the environment, can then be applied to all sensations, like pain or like color. And I'm going to show you how. I'm going to show you a few examples of how taking this sensorimotor approach helps you solve the explanatory gap with regard to sensations. So let's look at the question of color again. So under the usual view, the color would be generated by the activity of red-green or blue-yellow sensitive channels in the nervous system. And as I said before, this does not explain why colors are the way they are. So we need a different way of thinking about color, and I suggest that instead of thinking of it as a thing that is generated by color-sensitive channels, we think about color as a way of interacting with the world. So take a red piece of paper, for example, and you move it around under different colored lights, different illuminants. If you tilt the paper more towards the yellowish sun, the light coming into your eye is more yellowish. If you tilt the red piece of paper more towards the bluish skylight, the light coming into your eye is more bluish. And so the idea would be that red is not the wavelength of light coming into your eye. No, the quality of red is the way red things change the light. Now, how could we describe this mathematically? We can look at the light coming into the eye from the direct illuminant. So the L, M, and S cones would be sensitive, say, to the sunlight, and the activity of the cones could be described as a point in a three-dimensional LMS space. And that incoming light is then partially absorbed and partially reflected by the colored surface. So the light coming off the surface here will be different from the light coming in. And if the L, M, and S cones then sample that outgoing light, the outgoing light can be represented as a point in LMS space again. So essentially, what a colored surface does is it takes a point in LMS incoming space and transforms it to a point in LMS outgoing space. And it turns out that from the physics of the situation, the situation can be described by a 3x3 matrix. It's just a linear transformation. And it turns out that this linear transformation, you can calculate from physics, from pure first principles, what the matrix is for different colored surfaces. So for example, here are a number of colored chips that are used by color scientists, and you can calculate just from physics what the matrix is for each of these chips. And if you look at those matrices, it turns out that some of the matrices are singular, and that's a peculiar fact. What we mean by a singular matrix is a matrix that instead of taking information from a 3x3 point, a 3x3 space, and transforming it into a 3x3 space, a singular matrix takes information in a 3x3 space and projects it into a two-dimensional or one-dimensional subspace of the 3x3 LMS space. So in a way, matrices that are singular have simpler properties. The sensorimotor law that describes the way these surfaces behave when you move them around under different lights are simpler than other surfaces. So you can plot what I call a singularity index, an index of the singularity of the different surfaces. So here in the ground plane you have the different surfaces, and you show, and the index here is plotted on the vertical axis. And it turns out that there are 4 colored chips in the sample that I've shown you, which are highly singular. And the 4 chips turn out to be precisely the red, yellow, green, and blue chips. And this reminds us of something. It reminds us of a fact that in the 1970s, 2 anthropologists, Berlin and Kay, went around the world asking people to name these colored chips. And it turned out that in all sorts of cultures, all through different parts of the world, the number of people that had names for these different chips is plotted here, and it turns out that precisely the red, green, yellow, and blue chips that were singular in them as regards their matrices were precisely those chips that people gave a name to. So this is rather amazing, because from simple philosophical first principles, we were able to predict empirical data about the names people give to colored chips, something that anthropologists and psychologists have been puzzling about for many years. And so a philosophical idea here has amazingly predicted empirical result. I think it's kind of what I would call a victory of philosophy over science. So you see the singularity index and the results from the so-called World Color Survey are very closely related. So let's go back to the question that I asked at the beginning. Why is it that unique red, for example, requires a mixture of activation in the red-green channel and the blue-yellow channel instead of just being corresponding to maximal activation in the red-green channel. And why the similar argument can be made about what people perceive to be unique blue. It turns out that that these data can be perfectly explained also using the philosophical idea that I suggested earlier. It turns out that if you make the calculations concerning the singularity of colors as a function of the activation of the different neural channels that are activated, in order to get a pure sensation of blue, in order to make a singular matrix which gives you pure sensation of blue, you would have to get activation in the green channel and activation in the blue channel, and the same is true for activation of the red channel. You would, in order to get a pure sensation of red, the sensorimotor theory predicts this black line here. Suggesting that in order to get pure red, you have to have a little bit of activation in the yellow channel. And you see the dots here, the red dots, are empirical data, and the black line is the prediction from the sensorimotor theory. So again, another almost perfect prediction from philosophical first principles to a result that color scientists have been puzzling about for many years. So I hope to have convinced you that the sensorimotor approach concerning the nature of what fields are makes good predictions about color. I don't have time to talk about some of the other predictions of the sensorimotor approach. I want to talk just about the question of sensory presence. So remember, the question of sensory presence is the question of why fields feel like something rather than feeling like nothing. Why is it that thoughts don't feel like anything? Why is it that autonomic functions like the glucose in my blood don't feel like anything? In order to be explained using the sensorimotor approach, I need to think about the sensorimotor laws, the laws of interaction with the world that are involved in really seeing a red or really hearing the sound of a bell, for example, and have to compare those to the laws involved in thinking and imagining and autonomic functions, and I have to show what it is about those laws that give us the impression that sensory fields feel like something. So it turns out that when you're really interacting with the world, there are three things that describe those interactions which give us the sensation that what we're doing is a real thing that's happening to us. And those things are what I call bodilyness, insubordinateness, and grabbiness. Now, I don't have time to talk about bodilyness, insubordinateness, but I'm going to talk about grabbiness. So grabbiness is the fact that sensory systems in our sensory networks are programmed or hardwired so as to interrupt our attentive and cognitive processing. So in this picture, for example, you see that there's a change occurring, and that change is attracting your attention and is causing you to look at the thing that's changing. And this is part of what gives the sensation of seeing its visual presence. We know that if there should be a change in the visual field, that our attention will be immediately grabbed by that change, and so we will see what's going on. But if we make a change very slowly, which is what's happening in this picture, so this is actually a video showing how if you make a very slow change in a picture, people will in general not see the change that occurs. Even though the change is extremely big, you will probably not notice what it is that's changing. So if we just wait a little bit, the picture that you're now looking at is completely different from the picture that I showed you at the beginning, but probably you won't see what the change is in the picture. I can make you see the change by causing the change to occur quickly, and then your attention will be grabbed by it, and you will be very surprised to see how big the change was. So here I'll make the change very quickly there, and you see that the whole lower area of the picture changed from red to blue, but because the change was so slow, you didn't see it, showing that the grabbiness of visual channels is part of what contributes to your impression of seeing everything in the visual scene. So grabbiness is an important aspect, along with bodiliness and insubordinateness, which were the things I mentioned, that contribute to our impression of sensory presence. And this phenomenon is a phenomenon called change blindness. It can occur using different techniques: flicker, eye saccades, film cuts, etc. There's a big literature, and it confirms the prediction made by the sensorimotor approach that part of what constitutes the what it is like of vision, the fact that vision seems like it is present to us, that there's something it's like to see, is caused by this grabbiness of the visual channels. Now, I don't have time to talk about sensory substitution and the rubber hand illusion, which are other predictions of the sensorimotor approach, and which are also confirmed by empirical investigations. I want to talk about space, which is another question that I've been looking at recently to try and test the theory. So if you think about the brain sits inside the bony cavity there in the dark, and information is coming in along sensory channels. So at time t equals 0, neural input on the millions of nerve fibers might have different activities. So this would be activity on the nerve number 1 would be 13, and nerve number 21 would be number 2 would be 21, etc. You've got millions of nerves coming in with different activities, and then at a different moment the activities change, and then maybe the brain causes the body to act, and then the inputs from these nerves change radically. And this is what the brain sees. Now, how can the brain, from just looking at those activities, know, first of all, that this brain is connected to a body? Secondly, what the structure of that body is? And thirdly, how can the brain know that that body is immersed in a world which is three-dimensional, and that this three-dimensional world contains objects? How can the notion of space be deduced from just these numbers coming in and out of the brain? So where is the body? Where is the environment? How can this be deduced without knowing a priori that it's there? So this is the question that we've been trying to look at, and using the sensorimotor approach. And the idea that we have is that we have to study the sensorimotor laws that link input to output. And with a mathematician, I've constructed an algorithm that the brain could use in order to deduce from this these input-output laws the existence of three-dimensional space outside the body, and the notion of displacement, the notion of the body. Now, I don't have time to go into the method that we used, but just as illustration, we did a computer simulation of a simple agent to show that the algorithm we have proposed actually works. So this agent is a sort of like it's a two-dimensional agent. Looks like this tray here, and the tray contains a retina that moves around inside the tray. So this arrow shows the retina moving around in the tray. The retina is supposed to be the analog of my eye moving around in my head. So instead of a head, it has a two-dimensional surface, and the retina is just a two-dimensional retina moving around inside this surface. And the retina has photoreceptors, a number of photoreceptors, and the tray, which is the body of the agent, can move around in this two-dimensional world. The two-dimensional world contains lights, which are symbolized here by these stars. And we simulate the agent moving around and analyzing the sensorimotor laws that describe the input-output relationships, and then we want to check that the algorithm we use is able to deduce the existence of this two-dimensional space outside the agent. And so we need to do a kind of Turing test on the agent in order to check that it really is able to understand the notion of space. So we find a test in which the agent is like the subject in a psychophysical experiment, and we ask it questions requiring spatial knowledge, and then we show how the agent is able to pass these tests and display the idea that it's able to understand essential notions of space. So we tested three things: the notion that the agent is able to discriminate its own motion from environmental changes, the notion that the agent can have a path within the environment, and the notion of displacement. I don't have time to go into all of the different tests and all of the results, but let me just show you one of the tests here. This is the notion of path. So we started the agent off at a position in the environment, and we moved it to a destination, and that was the test destination, and we moved it we then, having remembered this test displacement, we then moved it again, but instead of moving it directly, we moved it through paths with a number of different segments. So we could have a 2-segment path, a 3-segment path, or higher numbers of segments, and we tested to see whether the agent was able to recognize that it had moved through the same amount, moved the same distance, despite the fact that it had moved through different numbers of segments. And we found that if the path ended up at the original endpoint, and if there was only one segment in the path, the probability that it recognized that it had made the same path was near 1. But if there were more segments, the probability was smaller. So it's very much like homing in an ant. You know that an ant will make a complicated path to go and find some food, and then it will be able to get back to its nest directly in a straight line. So essentially, this path notion simulates the ant's homing behavior, and it shows that this algorithm that we have developed is able to learn without any prior knowledge, without knowledge of the existence of space. It is able to do this. So that was one of the examples of the 3 tests. So the conclusion on space, although I haven't been able to go through all the details, is that our algorithm shows that a naive agent can extract the notion of space as a kind of medium or vessel in which the agent is immersed from first principles without any prior knowledge, without even knowing that there might be such a thing as space. And it does that by studying the sensorimotor laws, and it deduces what I call the functions phi, which correspond to the notion of rigid motions. And what's important is that essential in this discovery is the ability to act. without motion, without the agent actually having a body which it can displace around, the notion of space would not emerge. So sensorimotor laws are a vital aspect in the notion of space. So I haven't had time to go into all the predictions, and I've just given you the example of color and the example of space and the example of sensory presence, showing how the sensorimotor approach makes predictions and allows us to understand the notion of feel. And I hope to have convinced you with just this first step towards feeling that if we had robots that were able to interact with their environment and were able to deduce these sensorimotor laws, that it would be a first step to actually having feel. I haven't actually talked about emotions. Where am I here? I haven't talked about emotions, but I think that feel is even more basic than emotions. So I think that this sensorimotor approach is really the first step that's necessary. The idea is that experiencing a feel involves interacting with the world, and that the quality of that feel is constituted by the sensorimotor law that governs the interaction that you have when you're interacting with the world. And these laws describe why feels differ the way they do, and it gives a first step to understanding why feels have sensory presence. Notice that I haven't talked about something additional which is necessary, which is attention and cognitively accessing and the notion of self. These are additionally necessary, but I think these are notions that I think artificial intelligence will be able to deal with. So I really think that within the next 20 years, feel, emotions, and the notion of self are something that really is coming to robotics. I think there will be no problem to build feels into emotions in the next 20 years. If you want more information about my approach and all the details which I haven't had time to discuss, you can read my book, which came out with Oxford University Press in 2011. It's called Why Red Doesn't Sound Like a Bell. So that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I think on this, I think could be many. There could be many.
I have a question from Berlin. Hello? Well. My question is if fields must then humans build this feeling capability for robots, or at some point will this capability emerge from the fact of having a body and interacting with it?
Yes, I think that if you really think about what we mean when we say we are feeling something, we realize that feel is not some magical thing that's being generated by our brains. Feel is simply the fact that we are interacting with the world in a certain way. And I think we say that we feel things when the mode of interaction that we have possesses these properties of sensory presence, that is what I call bodyliness, insubordinateness, and grabbiness, and these could easily be built into a robot. In fact, the grabbiness, we could build in the grabbiness in such a way that if the robot is interacting with the world and some sudden change occurs in the environment, and then we could build the robot so that this interrupted its sensory processes and caused its attention and cognitive processing to be focused on the thing that changes. Then it would have the same kind of sensory presence or something it's like to the robot as our fields have to us. So I really think that if we build the robot so that its sensory systems have have the properties that our sensory systems have, then as soon as the robot starts interacting with its world, and as soon as the robot has the cognitive capacities to attend to the fact that it is interacting with the world, and is able to reason about that fact, well then we will say of the robot that it feels something, just like we say of ourselves that we feel something. So feel is not something magic. Feel is just a word that describes our potential to interact with the world in certain ways, and there's nothing to stop robots from interacting with the world in that way.
Okay, thank you.
So, are there other questions? I think there should be several at least. So, here we have a couple.
You said that there are three things that let you know that.
Вот, депутат, можете говорить.
Hello.
Он может говорить, да, сейчас? Или
May I ask a question again?
You said that there are three things that lets you know that you're interacting with the real world. Could you elaborate a little more on that, like in terms of how one can distinguish the difference between the real world or a deep dream, or if someone is sleeping or in some kind of a trance?
Right, so these here are the three things that allow us to distinguish between real sensory experiences and things that are not real sensory experiences, in particular thoughts, thoughts, memories, imaginings, and autonomic functions. So these three things are bodiliness, insubordinateness, and grabbiness. So bodiliness is the fact that voluntary actions systematically change sensory input. So if I'm really looking at a red patch of color, for example, and I move my body or move my eyes, the sensory input coming from the outside world changes dramatically. But if I'm thinking about a red patch of color and I move my eyes, there's no change in the sensory input. So bodiliness is the fact that moving my body changes the sensory input. And that is an obvious fact about information coming from the outside world. So bodiliness is one cue that tells us that what's happening, that the sensory changes that are occurring are real changes coming from my sensory systems. Now, that doesn't work completely because consider my proprioception. Proprioception is the sensation coming from my muscles that tells me that my muscles are moving and my joints are changing position. If I move my body, that information from my muscles changes systematically. So muscle input has bodiliness, just like the red patch of color provides bodiliness. So bodiliness is not enough because I don't feel the information coming from my muscles like I feel the redness of red. And that's why I need a second principle, which is what I call insubordinateness. Insubordinateness is the fact that sensory input can change also without voluntary actions. So I'm looking out onto the world and a mouse flits across the floor. It causes a visual change which is not caused by my body action. So my visual input is insubordinate to what's happening in the outside world because it is subject to changes that can occur in the outside world in addition to changes caused by my own body motions. So not only does the sensory system have bodiliness, but it also has insubordinateness. It's a question of control. I am in partial control of my sensory inputs, but I'm not in complete control. And that partial control is a cue to the fact that the sensory input coming in comes from the outside world. So if I'm dreaming, for example, or I'm hallucinating, that is completely under my mental control. And so it cannot be real. Only stuff coming in from the outside world has both bodiliness and insubordinateness. Only stuff coming from the outside world is under my partial control. And then there's grabbiness. which is what I already mentioned. Grabbiness is the fact that what constitutes information, what also characterizes information coming from the outside world, is the fact that any sudden change immediately attracts my attention and interrupts my processing. It's as though the brain has a kind of interrupt system, like in a computer, where when something suddenly changes coming from the outside world, it immediately attracts my attention and stops my normal cognitive processing. So those three principles characterize, allow me to distinguish between hallucinations, dreaming, and mental imaging from real events in the outside world.
All right, thank you. With all this information, do you have any way that, like some people are probably in a coma? These three principles, could they help to develop some kind of solution?
You mean to? I know that a lot of people are interested in making clinical diagnosis of people in comas to know whether they really are still conscious or not, for example. I really have nothing much to say about that, because for me, whether or not you are conscious is more a matter of whether you can interact with the world in the appropriate way. Take the analogy, for example, of imagine you took an animal and you froze the animal completely for maybe 10 seconds. Okay? Would you say that during those 10 seconds, and then you unfroze the animal, would you say that during those 10 seconds the animal was alive? Okay? Because during those 10 seconds the animal would not be able to interact with the world. So when you say to be alive is to be able to interact with the world. So if you're frozen, you can't really interact. And it's sort of a non-question. It's not the right question to ask whether the animal is alive when it's frozen. And I think it's the same can be said about consciousness. I think a person who is in a coma, or a brain in a vat, for example, a brain that cannot interact with the outside world, it's not really a question that you can ask. Is it conscious or is it not conscious? The usual sense of the word conscious requires interactions with the world, and it doesn't make much sense to ask the question of whether a person who is in a vegetative state, for example, and cannot communicate with the outside world, asking whether that person really is conscious or not is sort of not the right question to ask. But I admit this poses really severe ethical questions. What do you do with people who are in vegetative states?
Right,
so I really have no answers. Yeah.
Теперь меня слышно?
Ну да.
Hello? Yeah. So you've got no time to speak about emotions, but if I ask this question now, could you speak a little about emotions? Because your scheme about sensory presence, okay, it's pretty convincing, but I don't see how emotions fit into this.
Okay, so I think emotions are very interesting. I have not really thought very much about emotions yet, but I think that what really is an emotion? Okay, I think there may be different kinds of emotions. You could say that perhaps an emotion is like a normal sensory feel, like the feel of redness or the sound of a bell, but added into that normal feel, you have a bodily state. So, for example, I don't know whether you consider fear to be an emotion, but suppose it's true that fear or anger are emotions. So you'd say that these are not only sensory states, but they're also linked with bodily states. So when you're afraid, your heart beats faster, your blood pressure goes up, adrenaline circulates in your body. So you have these bodily changes that occur. And these bodily changes change the way that you interact with the world. So what I would say is that if I were to try to extend my theory to emotions, all I would really have to do is I would have to say that in addition to experiencing sensory input, you also have bodily changes that occur that modify the way you interact with the world. So I would just say that what you mean by the emotion of fear is in being in a certain way of interacting with the world in which your bodily states are changed in addition to your sensory states. So I would hopefully be able to account for emotions in this way.
Okay. Are there other questions? I think we could, at some point we will have to limit, but I think we can still take some minute if you have other question. Actually, I am repressing myself.
So what's your question, Fabio?
No, because we have some other question here, and then I will leave as the last one. Okay, so we have a question from the people connected in streaming, and then we have at least one question here from a student.
We have a question from Shilpa in India. And her question is whether this sensorimotor approach or theory could also apply to robots capable of seeing a larger part of the spectrum. So it's specifically related to the slides we saw earlier about the color vision and the singularity. Do you think those principles can also apply to a larger part of the spectrum?
So, as you saw that in my theory about color, I assumed that the color sensitivity was determined by the 3 photoreceptors sensitive to long, medium, and short wavelength light that we have in humans. But now, animals sometimes have additional photoreceptor types that are sensitive to ultraviolet light or to infrared light. And yes, you could make a theory which included those additional photoreceptor types. Then if you had 5 types of cones, then the description of the property of reflecting surfaces would involve a 5x5 matrix instead of a 3x3 matrix. And again, you could study the singularity of those 5x5 matrices. So there should be no problem in extending the idea to people with different numbers of photoreceptors. And you could also look at people with color defects like dichromats, colorblind people, or anomalous trichromats. And that's something I'm actually going to start working on with some color scientists. We're going to look at what predictions we make about the pure colors that are seen by anomalous trichromats.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes, when you mentioned about that in 20 years the robots can feel, what feeling is more difficult maybe for humans that replicate in robots? For example, if you can replicate some feelings in robot, it's possible that this robot can feel bad feeling to humans, or maybe it's possible to replicate.
Yes, I think that. I think that what I've been calling feels are really the most elementary feels that humans have, which have interested philosophers, which are what they call the problem of qualia, that is to say, the quality of experienced sensations. So like the redness of red or the sound of a bell. So I looked at that because those are considered by philosophers to be the most basic questions. But so when you say feeling bad about humans, you could can a robot feel bad about humans? I think that's a more complicated type of emotion, feeling happy or sad, or feeling angry, or feeling resentful of humans. These are complex social emotions or feelings, which are probably based on the elementary feels like the feel of red and the sound of a bell that I've been looking at. So I think that there's no theoretical problem involved in explaining these more complex sensations. And I think that, yes, that if a robot had sufficiently sophisticated cognitive apparatus, if it could think And if it had the notion of self, which I think is a social construct, if it had that notion, then certainly I think robots would be able to have feelings about humans and feelings about themselves. I think that poses no philosophical problem. It may pose a technological problem. It may pose a problem because I think such feelings are social phenomena. So I think robots would only have such feelings if they were immersed in a society of humans and robots. That's something that I discuss in my book, which I haven't been able to discuss today.
Okay, thank you.
So, other questions? So, if there are not... No, Nathan, no, let me finish. No, let me finish. So one is that use the word bodiliness and insubordinateness, which are not the usual buzzword embodied and situated. And so if you could briefly, because Nathan is pressuring us, to make a distinction, and the other maybe is more is related to the idea of consciousness as integration of information by tononi, for instance. What if how you relate? So two questions.
Okay, so
sorry for.
So bodiliness is, my idea is that bodiliness is just the fact that sensory systems change their what they are registering as a function of body motion. That's just a fact about sensors that are connected to the outside world. And obviously an embodied robot would have that, the sensory systems that such a robot had would have bodiliness. And I think it's just an obvious fact that a robot which did not have a body, which interacted with its world without being able to act and change its situation with respect to the world, well, it would be the sensations that it had would be of a different nature to the sensations that we have when we interact with the world. It would be a little bit like what happens if you put humans in sensory deprivation chamber. If you put a human in a sensory deprivation chamber, very quickly the human can no longer distinguish between sensations coming from the outside world and the human's dreams and thoughts and imaginations. You no longer get a sensation of reality. You can no longer distinguish your dreams and hallucinations from the real outside world. And that's because I think one of the things that allows you to know that there is an outside world is the fact that you can change incoming sensation by moving your body. So a robot that was not embodied would be like a human being who was just dreaming or thinking to himself and could never have a real sensation of an outside world. So that's the answer to your first question. With regard to Tononi and Edelman type approach, I think that really, as I understand it, what they say is that in order for me to feel the redness of red, I would have to have in my brain red-sensitive circuits which interact, whose activity interacts with the blue-sensitive and yellow-sensitive and other color-sensitive circuits. And they sort of say that it's that interaction in the brain that is generating the redness of red. And I think that saying that is a big philosophical mistake, because I don't see why interactions in the brain should generate any kind of sensation. I think it's a philosophical error to think that sensations are generated. Sensations are just not generated by brains. To think that is to make the same mistake as to think that life is generated by biological systems. Life is just a word that describes how we interact with the world. And feeling is just a word that describes how we interact with the world. We don't need to have something extra in the brain that involves some kind of magical interactions that somehow causes feeling to emerge, because that would be to think about what a feeling is in the wrong way. That's to make the same mistake as to think that there is a vital spirit. So that's my answer to your second question.
Okay, thank you so much. So I think we thank you for your great talk. So I think that now we can move if Sheng